Oh yeah, that just converted that. Oh, teach me that class. No, you're gonna take a different session.
Yesterday.
We should just have one for making a 6-year degree. She's literally every other country.
I got everybody, right? All right, so I know that was a little cumbersome. That we won't do it that way the next time. I just wanted to sneak a little bit more lecturing in here, especially because we missed that whole lecture. I try to have those posted same day. So assuming I don't have any problems with the Scantron, occasionally I need a little more time to think about whether to curve it and how much to curve it. And that sometimes depends on how many makeups I have to give. And if I got 10 people taking makeups, I might hold off a day or so. I do not give these exams back to you. So if you want to come look at them and see what you missed, you'll have to come to office hours. I just do that so I'm not making up 50 new questions every exam. I do reuse them. We do go through some of the most commonly missed questions in class. So once everybody's taken the exam. So got a few people sick, so we won't probably, I don't know, maybe we'll get to that Monday, I don't know. But okay, so again, I'll try to get those out to you or get your scores out to you pretty quickly. All right. And I did go through some of the homework already, the ones that kind of everybody answered. So I'll be going through those today and tomorrow. So okay. So where we left off last time, we had started talking about the unicellular eukaryotes. We talked about really that's the protists, which includes protozoa and alga. So remember, the protozoa are more animal-like protists, and the algae are the more plant-like protists. That's kind of the way your book defines that, so we'll stick with that. The other eukaryotes that are potentially pathogenic, that especially we're interested in, are the fungi. So there's different kinds of fungi, obviously. There are mushrooms, which we're not particularly interested in for this class. They're kind of cool. That's a picture of a puffball mushroom that was right behind my house a couple of years ago. We're more interested in the molds and the yeast. Okay, so those are all different kinds of fungi. The microscopic ones are the molds, or parts of course, you can see molds with your naked eye as well. And yeast, of course, are microscopic, but the reproductive structure on molds can sometimes be microscopic. All right. What do we need to know about fungi? We mentioned before, the cell wall is often made of chitin. There is some variability there, but chitin is a polysaccharide. And we're not going to really delve into the structure of that too much like we did for peptidoglycan, but we'll just make a note of that. And the other thing that we mentioned before, they are not photosynthetic. So remember, with some old methods of classification, the fungi and the plants were all grouped together. And then I think it was Whitaker that said, no, we're going to separate these into two different taxa. Okay. Significance. Why do we study fungi? Or how does fungi impact your life? It can do some good things for us and maybe argue some bad things. What do you think? What can you think of that you would come upon some kind of fungi in your life?
mold on fruit?
Mold on fruit. Okay, so it rots food that we want to eat. And that's a bad thing, but we could turn that into a good thing and we say that they are decomposers. Okay, or in other words, they're nutrient recycling. Okay, that's, you find a lot of fungi on, dead logs or, carcasses and things like that. So we'll turn that into a good thing. What else? Either good or bad about fungi. Maybe you don't think about it very much. Food. Yes, we eat it. Okay, I'm not a fan of mushrooms, but it's certainly legitimate. Yeah, and we could say drink as well. Yeast that's what does fermentation. So alcoholic beverages. Okay, there's somebody else. Infections. Okay, disease. Usually when a fungi causes a disease, we call them mycoses. We'll say singular, mycosis. Okay, a fungal disease is called a mycosis, and we're going to look at an example of one. Okay. I think anything else? What do you take if you have a bacterial infection? Yeah, you take an antibiotic. So there are fungi that produce drugs for us, produce antibiotics. Some antibiotics are secreted by bacteria, but some penicillium mold gives us fungi. And maybe one that you haven't thought of is thinking about symbiotic relationships. With plants. It's apparently a very common thing for plant roots to live in symbiosis with some kind of, usually some kind of mold-like or filamentous fungi. It helps plants absorb water. So that's what this picture is referring to here. I got that picture out from lawn treatment company. It was some product that was trying to encourage this symbiotic relationship and showing that grass that it lives in association with fungi. We're not going to worry about that term there. Is generally healthier than grass that doesn't have those symbiotic relationships. So we could argue that fungi benefit us in lots of ways. Okay, and those are pretty much what I thought of. All right, so I want to talk about some fungal structures a little bit. I will say I've cut back quite a bit on the terminology that I make students know, so you can be glad of that. I don't go through reproductive pathways anymore with fungi because we never really kind of circled around to it again. So, but some structures that I want you to know. If we look first at the filamentous or mold kind of a fungi or fleshy fungi, that just means mushrooms, that toadstools, they have a lot of the same kinds of structures. They are going to always have some kind of hyphae, and that's, again, that refers to filamentous growth. And we could describe that hyphae in lots of different ways. Some hyphae are septate, and that means that they have cross walls. And this is not a great picture of that over there, especially because it's a little dark and you can't see that very well. But in this picture, maybe I can get a color where this turns out a little bit better. In this picture, you can kind of see the cross walls here, some septae, that's kind of, you have distinct cells in those filaments, in other words. Some hyphae do not have cross walls. That prefix A means without. Okay, so no cross walls. So the B over here, aseptate hyphae, there are nuclei kind of scattered along that filament, but there's no cross walls in between there. So in other words, these are going to be considered multinucleate And we have kind of a special term for a cell that has more than one nuclei. We call that a senocytic cell. Make sure I spelled that right. Okay, again, that just means multinucleate. Okay, so if the hyphae have cross walls, there's going to be pores in those cross walls, so nutrients can be shared between the cells. So hyphae are either septate or aseptate. Okay, they're going to be one or the other. Hyphae could either also be described as either being vegetative or aerial. A vegetative hyphae, its function is to obtain nutrients. And we'll talk about how they obtain nutrients in a minute. They usually just absorb the nutrients. Masses of vegetative hyphae are going to be called mycelium. Okay, or I guess you could say plural mycelia, but we usually call it mycelium. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. Okay. And then aerial hyphae are going to be reproductive hyphae. Okay, and they are usually going to be growing off of the vegetative hyphae. There's many different kinds of aerial hyphae, many different structures, and that's often how we categorize the fungi based on what kind of reproductive spore structure that they have from, again, reproductive hyphae. Okay, oh yeah, so this is going to be the source of aerial spores. So we talked about in bacteria that spore formation is not reproductive, it's more of a survival feature. But for fungi, we're going to get lots of spores released, and that is their reproductive. So that's a good question. Can they be both? I don't believe so. I think it's one or the other. So again, your hyphae is either going to be septate or aseptate. It's either going to be vegetative or aerial. Okay. So here's an example, some examples, some pictures. Fungal mycelium. Okay, these are just, the molds that you see on your food. Hopefully not very often in the refrigerator or in nature. Visible to the naked eye. Oftentimes, even a mushroom is, which you doesn't seem filamentous, but underground it's going to have a vast network of hyphae probably. It's part we don't see. I like this picture from your book actually a little bit better, just the septate hyphae, the multinucleate, the senocytic hyphae. We're going to talk about pseudohyphae in just a minute, so stay tuned for that. Again, just another different drawings of the different structures. Here's a different way to just kind of draw mycelium, the masses of vegetative hyphae. The hyphae usually grow from the spore. Okay, so the spore lands somewhere, a nice, maybe moist place, and then the filament will grow from that. Here's an example over here of an aerial hyphae. That's a spore structure. In this particular kind, this is the spores that kind of, when they mature, they will detach and float away in the wind or whatever. Here's another example. These are aerial hyphae that are growing off of a vegetative hyphae. Here's some yeast. We're going to talk about that next. This haustorium, that's a term that we'll talk about in a second, but those are specialized hyphae that are going to be particularly good at invading living cells. So more about that in a second. Okay, so the other morphology that we see for fungi is the yeast morphology. They are small, we'll call them globular. They're not typically perfectly round like what you might see for a bacterial cell. They're kind of, globular like this maybe. Typically, they're going to reproduce by budding, which is kind of an unequal distribution of the daughter cell. So as we'll see next time, we're going to talk about this in more detail. When bacteria divide, they usually, split in half. And so yeast are typically gonna maybe just a little bit of it bud off and will detach. Sometimes that bud doesn't totally detach and kind of just stays attached a little bit, in which case we would call that a pseudohyphae. Okay, when the bud fails to detach. Okay, so that's what this picture over here is to the right. Why would that be advantageous to a yeast? That pseudohyphae may be better at penetrating some kind of crack somewhere in order to get nutrients. So, okay, maybe we'll say for penetration. All right, some fungi actually exhibit dimorphic growth. So that means that they're going to grow in two different forms. Again, the most common forms are the yeast-like and the mold-like. So both yeast-like, we'll say, and filamentous. Okay, so not all fungi are dimorphic. They can't all switch between totally different body shapes. Candida is an example of one that can, and that's a fungus that you hear about a lot. It causes athlete's foots and yeast vaginal yeast infections, thrush, all sorts of things. That's an example. In this picture here, you can see some little kind of roundish cells that can switch between that yeast-like form and the filamentous form. Depends on what environment it's in as to what form it's going to take on. And usually that's a temperature dependent thing. It's going to be one form in one environment and one form in a different environment. Okay, it's not a hard and fast rule as to which form it would take in which environment though. Okay. And then just kind of lastly, in terms of general information about fungi, we're going to go through this term in a little bit more detail next time. But chemoheterotrophic, that's a term that describes how an organism gets both its carbon and its energy. So we'll pick that term apart a little bit next time. But basically, fungi are most often going to get their nutritional sources both carbon and energy through organic sources. Okay, so carbon and energy both. Okay, so in other words, they eat stuff. Okay, so they're like us, we're chemoheterotrophs as well. They are a specific kind of chemoheterotroph. We would consider most fungi to be saprophytic, or sometimes we call them saprobes or saprophytes. I've seen that as well. And that just means that they're going to absorb their nutrients from dead sources. So how often do you see, mushrooms on rotting logs or trees that are dying, like that? Okay. However, there are some fungi that are considered parasitic. Okay, they can get their nutrients from living organisms. These are the ones that have a specialized hyphae called Hostoria. Okay, so you kind of see that down here. It's really easy for hyphae to absorb nutrients from dead organisms, because when those organisms are dead, their cell walls are breaking down, and it's just really easy for those hyphae to penetrate. If the organism's alive, if they're, in this case, it looks like a plant maybe in that little picture, if they have a cell wall that's intact, it takes a much stronger filament to be able to penetrate and in order to get the nutrients. So Hostoria, specialized fungi, and like I said, fungal diseases are going to be called mycoses. You see that prefix myco, and that usually means fungi. There are some exceptions to that, like we talked about the mycobacterium, okay, the acid-fast genus, that's not fungi, but I don't know where that came from. Okay, so we have a few minutes left. I want to talk about an example of a pathogenic fungi. If we have more time, we'll talk about some other ones at the end of the semester, but I wanted to at least make sure that we get one in, and I just kind of chose one. It might not be one that you've ever heard of. It's an infection called coccidiomycosis, also known as valley fever. And it's caused by actually two different species in the Coccidioides genus. Okay, so this is kind of unusual, but I've just said Coccidioides species. There's two different species that cause the same infection. And it's just one that lives in one geographical area and one we find in a different geographical area, and they both seem to cause the same disease. So we'll just not worry about which is which, and we'll just call them by their genus, Coccidioides. Okay, this is a fungus that lives in the soil, and humans get sick when they inhale the spores. So when does that happen? Usually when the soil has been disrupted, like a big disruption, like we have a construction site and they're moving dirt around, or there's a big dust storm, or maybe an earthquake. Okay, so big disruptions of soil is more commonly when people would inhale those spores and get ill. And sometimes people don't get sick at all. We think at least half the time people inhale them and it doesn't cause any disease at all. But when it does cause disease, basically it's a pneumonia. It's a fungal pneumonia. So, you know, fatigue, cough, fever, shortness of breath, headache, night sweats. Okay, a rash, which is kind of unusual. Don't usually see a rash with pneumonia, bacterial or viral pneumonia. Kind of odd looking rash. And most of the time this clears up on its own without any treatment at all. So, you know, and maybe 5 to 10% of the time people would have kind of long-term lung problems. It has the potential to form granulomas in the lungs, which is just kind of aggregates of you know, abnormal growth or aggregates of the organism that's still alive in the lung, and it can spread to other places in the body as well. Of course, anybody that's immunocompromised, meaning they're on chemotherapy or they have some kind of genetic disease, are going to be more at risk. People over the age of 60, and oddly enough, people of African descent or Filipino descent are a little bit more likely to contract it, and we don't really know why. Okay, so we'll finish up with that next time, and we'll start the next chapter 7 on growth. Have a good day, and see you Monday.